Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre.
And I'm Vianora Vinca. The Obama administration is promising to tackle immigration reform next year. So far, much of the discussion has focused on the fate of the 12 million or so immigrants living in this country illegally. But what about immigrants who live and work here legally or are seeking visas to do so?
On this edition of Independent Sources, we look at the impact immigration reform could have on H-1B employer-sponsored visas.
We focus on a problem that gets special attention during the Thanksgiving holiday, but is a problem year-round: hunger. And we talk with the host of a radio show about Indigenous culture, communities, and the struggle for civil rights. Those stories and news of the week after this.
Ethnic media is very important for us. The reason why, so that we can teach our culture to our children through this ethnic media. They know about the country, they know about the culture, but if there is no ethnic media, that means our culture is gone for the second generation.
Much of the public debate around immigration reform has been about undocumented immigrants, whether to grant them some form of amnesty, whether to pave a path to citizenship. But what does immigration reform mean for the many immigrants working in this country legally on visas sponsored by their employers? These skilled workers are often at the mercy of the job market as well as the government. Industry demand plays a role in who is granted an H-1B visa. To talk about some of these issues, I'm joined by Charles Goldsmith, an immigration lawyer, and Liliana Yanes of the CUNY Law School. Welcome.
Thank you.
Before we start, let's watch this report by Anjanette Levert.
Last September's stock market crash sent the lives of New York's Indian nationals into a tizzy. It ignited a crisis for those on temporary skilled labor work permits called H-1B visas. These government-issued visas allow United States companies to employ people with specialized skills when they cannot find a citizen with the same skill set. The Indian newspapers followed this aspect of the story closely because their readers are the largest recipients of H-1B visas.
Indian newspapers, the media cater to an educated class. That educated elite is extremely interested in a subject like H-1B because their children and their families aspire to work in better conditions and go overseas.
India graduates more persons in high-level mathematics and information technology than there's demand. India's excess keeps the U.S. as the leader of information technology, as most Indians with H-1B visas work in that field.
The U.S. remains on the forefront of information technology. If there are any new ideas coming out, the chances are they're coming out of somewhere in the U.S. And the chances are also that they are probably coming out of some immigrant entrepreneur from the U.S. These are the people who would be applying for jobs in American companies, staying for about 3 or 4 years, and then applying for green cards, and then going into entrepreneurship. That's always been the route.
Now that route has been disrupted, causing frustration and anxiety. In previous years, it was not uncommon for 150,000 applications to be filed in the first week of availability. This year, a completely different story. As of November 13th, almost 56,000 applications have been filed, leaving over 9,000 available. Immigration attorney Rio Guerrero knows the subject well, and he writes about it for the Filipino Reporter newspaper.
For the most part, those who apply for the visas, they're either educated here in the U.S. or overseas, but when they come here and they provide skill in much needed industries, and at the same time, they are, for the most part, not taking American jobs away from those who may be applying for them. They're just filling roles which the domestic economy is not filling on its own.
He says the Filipino community is experiencing the opposite effect of the Indian community. as many Filipino visa holders are in industries less affected by the recession.
The more common applicants are those who are in the healthcare industry, such as physical therapists, occupational therapists, but then there's of course also those who apply for, say, jobs as accountants and engineers. They now have the opportunity to still seek those visas, whereas in previous years it was just not available to them.
Both communities would like to see an increase in the visa applications. Mitra says many Indians would like to see a return to the 1990s when almost 200,000 visas were available and the cap was never reached. Guerrero believes the market should dictate the number as illustrated by this year. Anjanette Levert for Independent Sources.
Liliana, how badly are the highly skilled workers affected by the latest developments with the H-1B visas?
They're affected in, I think it's one thing to remember that the segment doesn't point out that H-1Bs are available to all foreign nationals, not just Filipino or Indian nationals. And what's particularly difficult for small companies is to hire an H-1B applicant.
Mm-hmm. About 40%, the statistics say about 40% of the H-1B visa holders go to Indian nationals, and as many as 20,000 have returned home due to the recession and the layoffs. Is that the case, and how has the other 60% been affected, if you could detail on that?
Sure, the other 60% is affected exactly the same way. We're talking about families in the United States, children in school, people who've bought homes here because if they're in H-1Bs, maybe they've spent 3, 5, 6 years in H-1B status and are told that now they have to go home. You have to sell your home, you have to move your entire family back to your home country.
Charles, are we seeing a more stringent H-1B policy nowadays with reports recently of fraud within companies and also with the new rule by this administration that companies who benefit from bailout money cannot hire people on H-1B visas? Is it a more stringent policy?
Well, there definitely is a more stringent policy, especially more difficult for smaller companies. The government has recently instituted a series of raids conducted by the Labor Department, by ICE, by other branches of the government to make sure that companies that are employing H-1B workers are complying with the terms and conditions of the petitions that were filed for them. And this is having definitely a chilling effect on employers, their willingness to sponsor H-1B visas. There's good news and bad news with regard to the TARP companies. The good news is that it's opened up H-1B visas, and I think one of the main reasons that there still are H-1B visas available is that there are no sponsors. The number of TARP funded companies that were sponsoring people has decreased because it becomes much, much more difficult to sponsor someone for an H-1B if you've received TARP funds. And that's left the pool of numbers still available. Of course, the economy is the big thing. That's the main reason, the fact that there's little hiring. The economy really hasn't recovered as we had hoped it would. And because of that, there's not that many people being sponsored because there's not that many people being offered jobs. And that's why, as of today, which is the end of November, there are still H-1B visa numbers available, which is an incredible thing when you look at what happened during the last 2 or 3 years.
Some critics say that as the economy recovers, we will go back to a rebound of H-1B petitions. Liliana, do you think that we're going to see that happening soon?
I don't see that happening soon. Hiring an H-1B employee is very onerous for a company. There are very high fees involved in hiring an H-1B employee. So an employer might look to hiring a U.S. worker because there are no fees in hiring a U.S. worker.
Let me bring up a quote by our Homeland Security Secretary, Janet Napolitano. She said recently at the Center for American Progress, "I've been dealing hands-on with immigration issues since 1993, so trust me, I know a major shift when I see one. And what I have seen makes reform far more attainable this time around." Charles, do you see reform happening in 2010?
Well, I'm hoping. Without a crystal ball, it's difficult for me to really tell you what's going to happen. I know that Comprehensive immigration reform was number 3 on the president's list of things that he wanted to accomplish, health care, the economy, immigration. There's a lot of pressure on the government to live up to their promises that they made to the American people about cleaning up the immigration situation. But the likelihood of it happening is probably partially dependent upon the economy recovering, partially dependent upon how he does with health care, because the feedback he's going to get as to the likelihood of the Congress willing to go through major changes will certainly reflect on his willingness to push it. And we're hoping that there will be some kind of immigration reform soon. We need it.
Liliana, we've seen the immigration debate in 2007 largely fail because of the heightened discussion about the amnesty issue. Do you think that amnesty will play a crucial role in the debate in 2010? Will it continue to be a stumbling block to reform?
I think it will be, and I think I'd like to trust Secretary Napolitano, but what we're seeing is no change in detention policies. And detention, and people are being detained who are just undocumented. They have no outstanding immigration violations, they don't have any criminal convictions, and yet they're detained. I'd like to see 3 things happen in this perfect world of immigration reform, or this imperfect world of immigration reform. One is true immigration reform for everybody who's here who's undocumented, right? A path to legal permanent residence with steps and not with huge fees involved. I'd like to see a return to the 212C program, where long-term permanent residents who've been convicted of minor convictions in the past are able to stay with their families. And I'd like to see a change in detention practices. Currently, asylees who present themselves at the border are put in detention until they can post bond.
Charles, do you see the same contentious debate happening in 2010 around the amnesty issue as we've seen in 2007?
Absolutely, I agree with Liliana. I personally think it has a lot to do with the economy. I think it's very difficult for people who are unemployed to accept comprehensive immigration reform, which gives legal status and the ability to work to people who they think they're competing with. So I think there's a lot of negative pressure against this type of comprehensive immigration reform because of the economy.
And unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you for joining us, Liliana Yanez and Charles Goldsmith. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Now here's Alana Rigal with some other news.
Thanks, Vianora. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. New America Media reports that the first print issue of the Kenya Monitor has been published. The Boston-based monthly paper is the first of its kind for the Kenyan community in the States. The Monitor's creator, Paul Wahithaka, says he also plans to launch a website for the paper. From the World Journal, the rate of unemployment among Asian Americans is at a surprising high. According to the Labor Department, unemployment among Asian Americans has doubled since last October, from under 4% to over 7%. The increase is the highest of all ethnic groups in the country, exceeding Hispanics and whites. The Forward introduced America's first black female rabbi. Rabbi Alyssa Stanton is head rabbi at Congregation Beit Shalom in Greenville, North Carolina. Hers is the only synagogue in the city. Stanton says she didn't choose to convert to Judaism, but that Judaism found her. She's been studying Judaism since 1987 and was ordained in June. And finally, from the Amsterdam News, the Caribbean has received $35 million in funding to fight HIV and AIDS. The region has been awarded the money, which will be administered by the Pan-Caribbean Partnership Against HIV and AIDS. More than 30 countries in the Caribbean will benefit from the funding, which would go towards buying generic and other drugs at better costs. Those were just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to you, Garry.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture recently released an alarming statistic. Last year, 49 million Americans lacked consistent access to adequate food. That's the highest number since the government started tracking what it calls food insecurity 14 years ago. The Food Bank of New York reports that in the last 5 years, nearly 4 million city residents have had difficulty affording food. With me to talk about some hard-hit communities here in New York are Adam Dickter, Assistant Managing Editor with Jewish Week, and Robert Hawkins, a professor in poverty studies at NYU's Silver School of Social Work. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Adam, you wrote a piece recently to talk about Jewish poverty, soup lines in Williamsburg, I believe. What led you to write this story?
Well, we continue to cover the poverty in the Jewish community, both the new poverty because of the recession and continuing poverty in the Jewish community. It's something we've always covered. And well, the story about that you're referring to is about 3 new kosher soup kitchens. There was one pre-existing in Borough Park. There's one opening up now in Williamsburg, another in Flatbush, and maybe as many as a dozen in the next few months, serving a growing need for food. People who just aren't able to put enough food on the table, and this gives them an opportunity to take their family out in a restaurant-like setting. It's called Masbia Soup Kitchen. And it's a remarkable place because of the fact that it tries to preserve the dignity of the people who are coming. It's not an easy thing to take your family out to a soup kitchen. And these kitchens, which are sponsored by the Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty and Masbia, which is a separate organization that was founded to help people who are struggling families. They're interested not only in making sure that these people meet the nutritional requirements to keep their families healthy, but also that they have some dignity when they're able to take their family out. And for the children, it's a nice experience. It has a feel of a restaurant, but there's no cash register.
And when I read this article, there was a quote that stuck at me, and I want to read it to you. It says, it's quoting Alexander Rappaport. He's a manager at the Masbia Kosher Soup Kitchen in Williamsburg. He's saying that, quote, Brooklyn is considered the capital of Jewish poverty, and Williamsburg is the capital in the capital. How severe is poverty in this area?
Well, it's estimated that about 60% of the Jewish community in Williamsburg is poor. It's a very heavily condensed community. It's a community with a lot of large families. There's insufficient housing in the community. It's a continuous issue. And there's a lot of poverty. There's families living below the poverty line. It is very hard to sustain a large family where you have sometimes as many as 8 to 10 children. You need a very big income to meet all the expenses for school. On top of which, aside from the ordinary expenses of raising a family, these families also face religious costs. They have their children in private school, which require tuition. There are ritual costs associated with being Jewish. Kosher food actually costs a little bit more than non-kosher food. So there's an increasing level of expense, and it's hard for these communities to meet those expenses. There's a large number of organizations, in addition to the help that's available to everyone, there's a large number of Jewish organizations that are also making available all the support that they can give to these families.
Robert, let's pull this out a little bit. I mean, is this a Jewish phenomenon, or where is this happening across the city?
Oh, this is absolutely not just a Jewish phenomenon. It's happening primarily in places like the South Bronx, but you see it in Staten Island, you see it in Manhattan, in the Harlem area, you see it in the Lower East Side, it's in Brooklyn, it's in Queens, it's everywhere. And what Adam is describing is this form of social isolation that occurs when there are low-income people. And in many ways, we have situations where families are together, groups are together, and there's a lot of good that comes out of that. But there's also a lot of poverty that comes with that. And what's a part of that is this sort of this social isolation. There's not a lot of economic power there. There may be a lot of social power there, but the economic power just hasn't reached these families.
Okay.
Well, there's a large insular consumer market where people will buy within that community.
Okay.
But there's only so many people who can go into that community market. There's much more demand than there is supply, and not everyone has the wherewithal or the resources to start a business in that community. Those who do can do very well, but not everyone can pick up and do that. You need a lot of investment in capital to start up a business.
Robert, it is estimated that about 1/3 of New York City residents live under the poverty line.
Yes.
How is that possible?
How is that possible? Well, it's possible because we have a pretty large wealth divide in the city. And you see this across the country, but you particularly see it in New York. And so you have this population who operates within New York City. They can't live the way the middle class, or really for Manhattan, the upper middle class lives. Okay. So there's this divide. We're in the middle of a recession. That's brought a lot of people into poverty. But really historically, you see particularly among racial and ethnic lines, you see this big divide that has been there, that has historically been there as well as currently.
Okay. Adam, let's talk about this sort of counterintuitive thing about poverty and Jewish. This is not something that goes together in the mind of most people, but it is the case.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because people do see a lot of prominent Jewish New Yorkers who are wealthy, not least of which is the mayor, who's certainly not worried where his next meal is coming from. But the fact is there are 21% of the Jewish community is living below the poverty line, according to a figure that was, the last figures compiled based on the census of 2000. We're in the early part of the decade. And in 2004, there was a little bit more of an intense study. Showed about 21% of the community living below the federal poverty line. About 10% of them living on about $35,000 a year per family. Those figures have certainly increased since the recession. You have people who are chronically poor, who have been poor before, regardless of the economic condition. And with the amount of opportunity now in the recession, people losing their jobs and unemployment climbing, I'm sure that number, when they take another survey and after the next census data, we'll certainly see a much larger number of percentage of people who are needy, people who are in need of services. You have families who are accustomed to a higher standard of living because they did well in good times and now are unemployed or underemployed. I think it's a growing segment of the community that is being served by the social service organizations are people who are underemployed, who have well-paying jobs, now taking the job far less than they were making before, and still have the same demands for their large families.
Robert, you've said that it's been difficult for people to accept the notion that poverty and race intertwine. Why is that? It seems like an obvious conclusion. Why is it difficult for people?
Well, it seems obvious to me, but maybe because I've been studying this for a while. But there are a few things that we struggle with in this country, in the city. We have ethnic groups that have historically been discriminated against. We have ethnic groups that have historically struggled economically. And particularly when you start to look at the African American population, Latino population, and you really have to start to ask yourself, well, is there structural racism, structural classism in place? Or is there something wrong with these people? And I actually don't see another choice. I don't see an in-between.
But I mean, what is so difficult about this concept that people just won't accept? I mean,
I think that's it. I think they don't want to accept that this is there's structural poverty going on. That this is a structural nature. They want to say, well, if we can get this population into a work environment, that'll help. Well, we've tried that historically. It helps the creamers. It helped the people who were more resilient, the people who needed a little push. We want to educate people. Well, that helps too, but that also has its limits when the jobs aren't there. But
like
there's
right
also,
now?
like right now, there's also a psychological impact. If you take away my education, my access to education, my access to jobs, that's going to have a psychological toll. That's going to create stress, which has an even more psychological toll. So it's the complexity that I think we are a little afraid of, and the complexity that's connected to race and class.
Okay. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it at that. Adam Dickter and Professor Robert Hawkins, thanks for joining us. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Radio is an important medium for Native Americans in this country, but stations actually owned or controlled by indigenous people are few and far between. To mark Native American History Month, Vianora visited the host of a radio show here in New York who says Native people have been forgotten in the struggle for recognition and civil rights.
Good morning. Good morning, folks out there. Welcome to WBAI.
Tiokasin Ghosthorse opens up the airwaves every week with Indigenous greetings.
It is a miracle for us to be here and also a privilege to be on the air. Our guests are from every continent on earth, endangered, unheard, and in some cases disdained and forbidden from ever being heard on both mainstream and in the neoliberal left, and whether it is alternative or progressive radio.
Ghosthorse says that the Indigenous are being denied a voice. That in a day of much progress when it comes to equal rights.
Native people are looked at in a sense that we are antiquated, that we are of the past and that we don't count in the roles of this country. And often you hear all the other races, white, black, and yellow, and you hear these, and you never hear Native Americans.
With more than 500 federally recognized tribes in the U.S., Native ownership of radio stations is now less than 0.3% of the more than 13,000 radio stations nationwide. Ghosthorse took a look at 43 Native stations to analyze their ownership and operations.
Out of those 43, about 39 were not really Native-oriented. Because they were religious and mainstream American foundations and corporations funded. And so they had more of a play than the Native people.
Last year, the FCC granted 29 new radio station licenses to Native tribes and organizations in an effort to raise their number. That brought their total to 62 nationwide.
Most likely, if they were bought, it had to be nations, or we call them tribes here in the United States, that had money, and most tribes that have money are casino populated areas. When you get to the more dire relationships with reservations where there is no population, the poverty says that you probably won't be able to buy a radio station. And the ones that do exist in remote parts of the country often are on a shoestring budget and often looking for donations to keep the words going and alive, whereas the opposite I described earlier, the effect of having money, often you don't talk about the reality of Native issues.
A reality that includes stories like displaced tribes who still fight for federal recognition, racist attacks, sexual violence against Indigenous women, border issues, energy policies impacting the Indigenous, and the climate. Ghosthorse is optimistic that as the mainstream is shifting focus to the climate change, the relationship with the Indigenous is also changing.
I think the change is happening already. Merely by one of these interviews like this. First Voices, or Indigenous radio, brings, if not the last cries, the first cries of another way to think, because we know that's going to have to come down to earth again, and the water and the wind and how we live with each other and other species on this planet.
Listen to this. Turn it up.
Find the cost of freedom, buried in the ground.
For Independent Sources, I'm Vianora Vinca. That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.
In the meantime, be independent-minded.
The salary is the same, and the food prices and other commodities are going up, but the extremity is the food prices.
For me, the price of my groceries have been about the same, so I haven't noticed any increase in food price.
Food prices done went way up. You figure a year ago you was paying $2.25 for a gallon of milk as opposed to $4 and some change today. That's a drastic change.